Hey there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode. On today's show, we're going to be taking a look at Double Dragon on the Nintendo Game Boy, which was brought to us by TradeWest. And before we start, I'd like to thank everybody, of course, for joining me on yet another weird port of Double Dragon review. You can definitely see a trend starting to develop here. This particular version of Double Dragon isn't really based on the arcade per se, but kind of like the PC Engine version of Double Dragon 2 is more so based on the NES port of the original game. It does feature 4 missions just like in the original game and, well, every other version of the game, but they are laid out a little bit different in the Game Boy iteration of the game. Some of the stages have little sections here and there that are sort of mixed around, and Stage 2 on the Game Boy is almost completely different than any other version. The characters and bad guys that you'll run into and fight are pretty much the exact same as every other incarnation of Double Dragon. The usual cast is all here and accounted for, although the layout is a bit different since, of course, the stages are kind of moved around a little. There are some design differences as well concerning the enemies, the most notable, of course, being the design of the Linda enemies. They look almost completely different than the versions in the NES port that had the giant red afros. Another difference here is on Abobo, and although the character himself looks pretty much the exact same, he is way bigger, and he's got a lot more moves now. He can pick you up and punch the shit out of you, which is definitely sort of off-putting if you're used to the arcade or NES versions. As far as the gameplay goes, probably the biggest difference between the NES port and the Game Boy iteration is just simply that you don't have to earn the moves like you do in the NES port. All of your moves are right there and available for you to use right off the bat in the Game Boy version of the game, which is definitely nice, although some have been tweaked. For example, the ultra-reliable elbow move that you can do in the original NES version does not do nearly the amount of devastating damage that it did in the NES port. Another thing that you may have been noticing by now from watching some of this footage, as far as the gameplay is concerned, this one is a bit slower than the NES incarnation. The Game Boy version is a bit sluggish, not nearly as quick and responsive as the NES, and Billy does have what seems to be the world's slowest jump kick. Even with the gameplay slowed down quite a bit, which isn't terribly uncommon for games on the Game Boy back in the day, thankfully it still does feel a lot like Double Dragon, and be that as it may, it's still a very fun game. Unlike the really odd Game Gear port of Double Dragon, or even Double Dragon 2 and 3 on the Game Boy, which really weren't that much fun at all. Graphically, Double Dragon on the Game Boy looks pretty damn good. The characters are fairly large, they animate pretty well, and obviously the game is a bit flatter than some of its other ports on the NES or even on the Genesis or arcade, but again, it still does look good, animates well, and there's really not too much slowdown. The different backgrounds that you'll come across throughout the game also do look really good. And as I had said before, I have to say I am a fan of some of the character redesigns or some of the little changes here and there. A lot of sections in the 3rd level look really good too and definitely stand out. Oh, and speaking of which, as far as a 3rd level is concerned, they did feel the need to go ahead and cram in that aggravating cave section from the NES port with all the platforming and having to dodge those spikes that fall from the ceiling. So yes, that kind of sucks, but hey, it still looks really good. And keep in mind too that the footage you're seeing here was recorded on a Super Game Boy, so obviously it's got a little bit more color than it would normally on the actual Game Boy. Sound and music in this one is also pretty impressive for the Game Boy, or the limitations of the Game Boy for that matter. The music is basically just recycled tracks from the NES port of Double Dragon, but hey, that is not a bad thing. After all, the NES port of Double Dragon had some of the more memorable versions of all the great Double Dragon songs. So there you have it, guys. That is Double Dragon on the Nintendo Game Boy. A pretty fun port of Double Dragon. While not being terribly accurate to the arcade game, it's still a lot of fun to play, and definitely worth picking up for the Game Boy. It's also very reasonable and can be found usually for under $10, maybe even under $5. And for that really cheap price, I can totally recommend picking this one up for your Game Boy. It's a lot of fun, the gameplay is great, the graphics and sound are really good, and at the same time, it's very interesting to kind of see the little bits and differences and variations between the characters and stages in this game and some of the other ports. And as always, guys, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for watching, subscribing, and commenting. And until next time, stay classic.